If you look at the size of the public service now versus pre-pandemic, what would the scope of that kind of cut look like?
Yeah, if you go back to pre-pandemic, you're looking at tens of thousands of positions potentially eliminated across the public service.
That means the Liberals lied their faces off during the campaign. The interim parliamentary budget officer continued to raise alarm bells about Carney's spending when he sat down with Vassy Kapellos to address questions about what we could expect from the Liberal budget. Not only did he talk about hundreds of billions more that Canadians should expect in the future, but that tens of thousands of public service job cuts could be coming. Let's take a look.
Hi, Mr. Jakes. Pleasure to welcome you back to studio. Thanks for making the time.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the invitation.
We're all, of course, thinking of and looking ahead to the budget. You've got a new report out today on capital spending on defense that I think is kind of interesting in the context of the budget. You make two very specific findings about how much they're spending now and also how much they've been unable to spend. What do you think Canadians should know about that in light of the budget coming down the road?
Well, I think on your first point, I think that's one of the key highlights, and that's we currently have within the Government of Canada's spending plan for defence. So this is the capital plan. So this is the F-35s, along with the Navy and other types of armaments. We're looking at around $300 billion over the next 20 years, and that's only for NATO 2%. So this goes back. The data we're looking at goes back to June. It does not include the additional commitment that's been made since that period of time to get up to NATO 5%. So if we're at 2%, 300 billion at 2%, we're looking at substantially more. So additional, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars on defense in order to hit those targets.
And can you put that in a historical context? Like, how much is that? How much money is that compared to what we usually spend?
Historically, it is a multiple of what most Canadians would be familiar with. I know there are probably some viewers who would remember World War II, so we're getting close to that period of time, a little bit after probably the 1950s or so. I think during the 1980s and 1970s, we would see defense spending at around 3% of GDP, 3 and a bit percent, going up to 5%, even with the dual purpose aspect. So spending on infrastructure that could be used for defense as well as other areas. Even with that, it's a very high number, and critically, it's a really big increase within a very short period of time.
And there we have it, folks. $322 billion incoming over the next couple of years. And he's saying that's 2%. So the NATO target that countries are asked to hit is that of your GDP, right? And our GDP has been going up as a result of all of these immigrants coming in. And then you have our GDP per capita, meaning our standard of living, going down because of all of the immigrants coming in. And again, it's not the immigrants' fault. It's the government's fault for running the actual program and telling all these people that we have all kinds of opportunity and our government services can support you and all of this stuff. Meanwhile, we know the opposite is true. So roughly 300 billion, 322, but let's, for math's sake, say 300. So he says that's 2%. And that's not the 5% that Mark Carney is saying, oh yeah, we're going to hit. What would that be? Folks, what that would be is 2.5 times more than that 300 billion. Quick math, what does that mean? That means we're talking $750 billion. $750 billion, folks. Now remember, previous video, we said that the $100 billion in deficit spending this year, and that's what's expected if everything comes through, that's going to cost every Canadian, baby to adult, around $2,500 more in taxes per year. That's what that's going to cost. Now you multiply that by 7. That's a lot, folks. That is a lot. How much is it? Well, you just do the quick math. That's going to be around, what's that, $17,500 per year per person? Per person. And this isn't taking really into account what inflation's going to do, right? They will saddle this with probably a 2 to 3% inflation. Now, if inflation goes up, that whole number is shot to hell. So imagine that. Mark Carney, with the deficit spending coming into play, because there's no way he can offset that, is going to cost every person in Canada, even a baby that was just born, $17,500 more per year in taxes. Think about that.
In that context, I actually want to ask you, because part of your analysis also reflected on the allocation of money but not spending it over time. And I'm wondering, given that the scope of the planned increase, if that would be a concern for you moving forward.
I think and it's less of a concern for us because we only keep track of the numbers in the budget. It's definitely should be a concern for the government because, as you point out, what we've seen, at least in the first 5 or 6 years of the original plan, was that there's close to $20 billion that they planned to spend on equipment that was not spent. And in the situation where not only do you have to spend the money to achieve the NATO commitment, but as everyone realizes, there are very real and imminent threats that Canada faces at this point. You actually need to procure the equipment and the material. And as time goes by, if you're not able to spend the money, you're not able to procure the equipment. And as well, from an accounting perspective, everyone knows how pernicious inflation is. And so if you don't actually acquire the equipment in the time period provided, by the time you do, the money is worth less. So you potentially have to buy less than when you originally anticipated, or you have to pay more. Combination of the two.
And this has been the story with the F-35s, folks. We've been saying that we were going to buy them and then not, and then buy them and not, and they've doubled in price, and we haven't bought any. Haven't bought any. And they've doubled in price because we've just sat around and done nothing. And then Carney comes in and says, oh, well, maybe we better, think about this. We better think about this and do a review. The review has been done for years, but this is the issue. So they're going to spend all this money, but the timing of it is the problem because they may earmark it for something and then say, oh, okay, well, it's gone up in price. Well, we can't do anything about that. We'll just spend more. And that's the way this Liberal government has been operating. Under Justin Trudeau, under Mark Carney. Makes you wonder, oh, maybe that's where Justin Trudeau got this mentality from, Mark Carney, because now we're seeing it on steroids.
So the overall budget is under a week away. When you get that budget and you're able to look at it, what kinds of fiscal anchors will you be utilizing to assess the sustainability?
I think the first one is the one that most economists would look to, and I'd say it's the one that the Government of Canada has looked to in the past, and that's the debt to GDP anchor. So what does debt look like in comparison to the overall economy, and is debt growing faster than overall economic growth? And the Government of Canada itself has indicated that a declining debt to GDP ratio is a very important indicator of fiscal sustainability, as well as important for ensuring or securing Canada's AAA credit rating. It's also something that the Liberal Party of Canada campaigned on as part of their election platform in April. And most recently, the Prime Minister indicated, I believe it was September 17th, that declining debt was something that was part of the fiscal anchors for the current government. So that's definitely the first thing that I'll be looking at.
Based on what you've seen announced thus far, and quite a bit has come out about what their intended spending is, we don't know necessarily exactly what they're going to do on the spending where government operations are concerned. But based on what you've seen so far, do you think it is realistic that that ratio would go down?
It's definitely possible. And I think certainly again, we don't have a lot of clarity right now precisely what the government has in mind. One could foresee a situation where spending and the deficits are substantially higher in the initial years, and there's a substantial increase in spending on capital. And at the same time, in the outer years, economic growth as a result of those investments starts to pick up. And as a result of that, you have a declining debt to GDP ratio in the outer years. And that's, again, what one would hope to see with the potential additional spending that's on the table. The other point of consideration, and something else that we're going to be looking at in detail on this coming Tuesday in the budget, are the cuts. So the Prime Minister has used the word austerity. And I was working for the Parliamentary Budget Office in 2012 with Kevin Page when Kevin had to take the government to court around the transparency or lack thereof with respect to the impact of the cuts. So something we're going to be looking at in detail is, are the cuts actually provided? Is there a listing of the cuts? Can we see the cuts by program? Do we know which public servants are being laid off across those programs? And can the government actually articulate clear service level impacts?
Okay, so there's a lot there. Remember how Chrysler Freeland would keep standing up and say, you know, we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio, blah, 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 even though they were spending like, you know, with reckless abandon. But their spending with reckless abandon under Trudeau feels like conservatism at this point compared to Mark Carney. Yeah, remember that. And in April, Mr. Jakes says, this is what they campaigned on. Declining debt. We're going to spend less. That's what they kept saying. And Mark Carney, even in September, says, declining debt, that's going to be one of our fiscal answers. Yet, if you're C.D. Howe and these other think tanks and they're doing their analysis, they're saying, well, we're expecting the deficit to be $100 billion. Well, that doesn't sound like declining deficit. That doesn't sound like a fiscal anchor. That doesn't sound like anything. And I applaud the objectivity and nonpartisanship of Mr. Jakes, because he's basically saying, well, the only way this works is if initially you spend all this money and then you invest it, and then as a result of that you see the economy and GDP substantially increase in later years, thereby reducing your debt to GDP ratio. But the problem is in the short term it's going up. Your GDP ratio is going up. So this is Justin Trudeau all over again. Remember that? You know, we're gonna run a series of small deficits, and then we'll invest in Canada's economy, and the budget will balance itself. So this is just this same thing, but industrial scale, right? It's the industrial size Justin Trudeau in terms of the spending, and this is Mark Carney. And funny that, the budget never balanced itself in 10 years. It's like you can't just let the economy manage itself. And it's like massively increasing your debt doesn't reduce your debt. Funny that. And I'm not an economist, and I'm not a banker, and I don't have a PhD that I plagiarized, but I seem to understand that, and I think Canadians do too. But let's get back to these cuts that the Parliamentary Budget Officer is talking about.
Because
is that what constitutes transparency in your mind? Like, those things need to be spelled out. You can't just say, you know, we're going to adjust the workforce by 10,000.
Oh, no. And again, going back to the precedent set by Kevin and the office as part of Budget 2012, that's the foundation. Without that information, parliamentarians, they won't know what they're voting on in terms of spending constraint and cuts. So that's something that we're definitely going to be looking at in detail as soon as we get our hands on the budget.
One final question for you on the scope of those cuts, because yesterday the finance minister said something very interesting, which I had not heard him say before, in response to questions about what you just mentioned, in that basically the size of the public service had to get to a more sustainable level. Sustainable is the word I believe that he used. And he referenced a period before COVID. If you look at the size of the public service now versus pre-pandemic, what would the scope of that kind of cut look like?
Yeah, if you go back to pre-pandemic, you're looking at tens of thousands of positions potentially eliminated across the public service. Again, on our end, less about the people and it's really about the programs. So public servants are hired to support government programs that the people of Canada benefit from. And that's why, notwithstanding, it's a good starting point to figure out how many public servants might be affected by the budget on Tuesday. What we're more interested in is what are the actual service level impacts and what are Canadians going to feel? Because on our end, one of the things that, as an independent parliamentary budget office, one of the things we've seen in the past is if the government doesn't have a clear sense of the service level impacts, there's a very high risk of retrenchment. So if something is announced, the service level impacts are significant, and politically it's not sustainable to actually carry it out or actually implement what they've initially announced.
And just to be clear, is it acceptable if they say stage 1 in this budget is the volume, stage 2 is figuring out how that unfolds?
I guess it comes back to, as a transparency organization, absolutely not.
Tens of thousands of jobs. We covered this. We covered this because there's some really smart and intelligent people out there in organizations that have been working on this for months. And one of the earlier ones, and I think it might have been CD Howe, I can't recall at the time of recording this, but they said that we could be seeing up to 90,000 people. And if you listen to Francois-Philippe Champagne and believe him, that's probably going to be pretty close to pre-pandemic levels. So what does that mean? Well, that means the Liberals lied their faces off during the campaign because they were trying to paint the Conservatives as the big bad Conservatives and they were going to cut on everything. And if you don't believe me, it's still on their website. Mark Carney's Liberals to protect and modernize Canada's public health care system. 1 week before the election, folks. Charlottetown PEI. This election comes at a time of crisis. President Trump is trying to fundamentally reshape the international trading system, and in the process, he's rupturing the global economy. With Canada, he has been even more direct and aggressive. He is trying to break us so America can own us. Unlike the Conservatives, who will, quote, slash public services, end quote, a Mark Carney government will protect and build a strong economy and strong Canadian institutions that are more important now than ever, including public health care. April 20th, Pierre Poilievre hiding more than $140 billion in divisive cuts. This election comes at a time of crisis, in case Canadians didn't know. President Trump is threatening our economy, our sovereignty, and our Canadian way of life. Yesterday, Mark Carney released his plan to stand up to President Trump and his unjust tariffs and build the strongest economy in the G7. But with just a week left in the most consequential election of our lifetimes, Pierre Poilievre still hasn't released a costed platform. Pierre Poilievre is hiding $140 billion in cuts that will weaken Canada and refusing to answer questions about them. Quote, Pierre Poilievre has promised $1 in savings for every new dollar is spending, and so far in this campaign he's promised more than $140 billion over 4 years in unmatched new spending, end quote, said Francois-Philippe Champagne, Liberal candidate for Saint-Maurice Champlain. The Conservatives' real plan is to make cuts. What will he cut to match those commitments? Who will be left vulnerable, and how much will these cuts weaken Canada's economy? It's time Pierre Poilievre stopped hiding and come clean about his divisive cuts. Pardon me. The irony is insane. You have Francois-Philippe Champagne in that Liberal article on the Liberal Party website. If you don't believe me, articles are in the sources of this video in the description. So it's always there. So he's saying that there, oh, they're hiding these divisive cuts. They're not being honest with Canadians. And meanwhile, when they're trying to say that they're the ones that are going to be protecting the public service, 6 months later, they're going to be cutting tens of thousands of jobs. They had people door knocking in Carleton, telling those public service employees, hey, you better not elect the Conservatives because you're going to lose your job if you do. I wonder how everybody's feeling now.